Okay, it's now 10:01, so good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you for joining us. This is now the third installment of our Quality Essentials support session, and for those watching from our recording from our YouTube channel, thank you for taking the time. It's our hope that you're gaining valuable insight into what it takes to meet the standards under review today. And just to take a moment to review our program standards under review, we'll be looking at our checklist here. We'll be looking at items 10 through 13. So we'll see that's standards 5.1, 4.1, 2.4, and 6.1. All of these standards are worth 3 points. So that tells us that these are considered essential. And with respect to items number 10, 11, and 13, these are our alignment standards. So you can think of these being another super alignment session. And sorry, I have something going to the background. Yeah, it's just landscaping today. But yeah, so these are, again, our super alignment session considering the standards under review. And to help us make sense of this, here we have our facilitator, Dr. Adam Khan, who is well-versed with Quality Matters and has even successfully built his course around them. So thank you again, Adam, for facilitating today.
As always.
And also, I'm sorry, well, yeah, really quickly. And also with this, our instructional designer, she'll be facilitating the breakout rooms at the end. So that way we can review the standards together and how they look like in your course and provide suggestions and maybe some feedback. So with us today, we do have Mark Lim, Krista Majori, and Adam Mitchell is actually not joining us today. He's running another training, and myself, Paul Quesada. So that's 3 out of 4 today, still pretty good. And to help us get started with the first under review, Dr. Adam Khan, now whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Sure, let's just go a refresher of alignment in general, of what the different elements of alignment are. So last week we talked about you have your course learning objectives and you have your module learning objectives built on those course learning objectives, and ultimately at the end of the day, you will assess the extent to whether students have mastered those learning objectives. To support that, then, you have learning activities, which involve the practice of the learning objectives, the instructional materials, which are your materials. These are usually the things that students consume, they read, they watch, they listen to, and then the course tools of, say, what you're going to use on Beachboard or Extensive, and those instructional materials, learning activities, and tools support the learning objectives in building students' mastery for the assessments. Now, one thing about assessment that Quality Matters doesn't distinguish, but are important to think about, are the idea of formative versus summative assessment. Formative assessment is assessment you do along the way. So what you might assess a module as it's going along, and the purpose of formative assessment is to give you, and even more importantly, your students, feedback on the extent to which they've mastered the learning objectives. This contrasts to summative assessment, which looks at the breadth of knowledge together. So this is usually an exam covering multiple modules or a final paper. As I said, Quality Matters doesn't make this distinction between formative and summative assessment, but by not making that distinction, sometimes it's not clear whether certain things are learning activities or formative assessments. And in fact, I've been through lots of Quality Matters trainings through QM, and I've seen some trainings say, oh, formative assessments are assessments. Others that say formative assessments are learning activities. For the purposes of the Quality Essentials, I don't think we'll be that picky in ensuring that, but usually your learning activities, as I said, they involve practicing the learning objectives. And if you were to list all your learning activities, watching, consuming the instructional materials, reading the instructional materials are examples of learning activities. So you may have a textbook as an instructional material. Reading the textbook is a learning activity, as those are the things students do in order to build their mastery of the learning objectives. Formative assessment, at least how I do it in my course, I treat them as learning activities. So on one hand, it does help me and students get a sense of their knowledge in performing the assessments, but get their knowledge prior to performing the summative assessments, but it gives them practice. The learning activities are the things students do. So let me share my course. And let me just choose a particular module. So this module is about persuasive effects. And in this module, students first read the textbook, which constitutes instructional material. The reading of the textbook constitutes a learning activity. And then they watch these videos. The videos are instructional material, and the watching of the videos constitutes a learning activity. So reading a textbook is a learning activity. It is not a formative assessment. Formative assessment is where you do see the degree to which students master their knowledge. So reading textbooks, watching videos, them alone are learning activities. A quiz is formative, yes. And in fact, the two types of learning activities / formative assessments. And as I said, sometimes certain QM reviewers will consider formative assessments as learning activities. Others will consider it assessments. But what I do is, after students watch these videos, and one thing you'll note is that with all these videos, with the reading, I note to students what learning objectives they correspond to. Now that is related to a different standard. In some respects, it's related to 2.4, which is one of the standards we'll cover today. But one way you can ensure that your learning activities and your instructional materials are aligned with your learning objectives is to number it, to say, this textbook chapter supports these learning objectives. These videos support these learning objectives. So if you ensure your instructional materials align with your learning objectives, and clearly your learning activities of reading the textbook, watching the videos correspond to the learning objectives. What I then also at the end of every module have what I call as a self-check. A self-check are a set of true-false questions, and they're deliberately, in my case, written about things that students make common errors on exams. So doesn't have, if you do a quiz at the end, it doesn't have to be common errors, but again, these self-checks are meant for my students to verify whether they know their knowledge. So in some respects, taking them are both a learning activity and an assessment, but also one aspect of these self-checks is they're true-false. They have automated responses. So reading the correct answers and letting students know what module learning objectives those correspond to is an example of a learning activity. And finally, I have a discussion activity where I give them a prompt and I verify that the prompt aligns with the learning objectives. Here I say it has to do with 1, 2, 3, 4. And in that case, I made sure that in this question that students have to actually address modules 1, 2, 3, 4. One thing I found in having reviewed other courses is sometimes discussion boards are topically related to a module, but they don't actually ask people about learning objectives. And in fact, just in students taking this course, when students take this, sometimes when they don't read through the instructions carefully, they just address the prompt at face value, partly because in many of their classes, discussion boards are answerable, at least using rubrics, in 3 or 4 sentences. And in some cases, your learning objectives can't be answered in 3 or 4 sentences. So you want to make sure it's very clear to students how if you use discussion boards as a learning activity or assessment, make it very clear to students what they need to do in order to demonstrate or practice the learning objectives. I like to tell students in my classes that if you're finding discussion boards busy work, come talk to me, because you probably need to rethink your approach to them. Because I try to emphasize over and over, the purpose of the discussion activities are to practice the learning objectives. So by asking students to here, actually, I list in an excellent discussion activity post will do the following things. Well, those following things I list are actually module learning objectives 1, 2, 3, 4. So here the discussion board is used. While there is the assessment component in that I give it a grade, it also allows students to practice the learning objectives and comment on one another's work. And I recognize that it would be nice if there was this clear distinction. QM tries to treat it as if there's a very clear distinction, but in practice, sometimes these things are blurry. But the key with your learning activities is it practices the learning objectives. So you don't want a discussion board to be there if it's not practicing the learning objectives. So if I had just said, how persuasive can media messages be? Even though that's topically related to the module on persuasive media, it alone does not necessarily address the module learning activities. So you want to make it as clear as possible the relationship between the learning activities and the learning objectives. And this actually corresponds then to the standard 2.4, which is actually one of the ones we'll cover today. So in reality, you want to put those slides back on the essentials today. What I just demoed sort of simultaneously covers instructional materials, 4.1 aligning, as well as the next one. So we covered 5.1 with learning activities, aligning with learning objectives, 4.1 instructional materials with learning objectives, and 2.4, the relationship between the learning objectives or competencies are clearly stated. In then doing this standard 2.4, by making sure this relationship is clearly stated, it then ensures that everything is aligned in terms of standard 5.1 and 4.1. Now, I demonstrate this 2.4 with a numbering system. It's also possible to do this with a course map, where you say, here are module 1, here are all the learning activities, here are the learning objectives they correspond to. It can be done just with narrative paragraphs. So in this module, you will read this chapter so as to advance your knowledge of learning objective, blah, blah, blah. And then you will do this activity to practice it. It goes back to the whole idea with QM, there are many ways in which you can meet standards. And if you go to the QM rubric and look at this standard 2.4, it gives you many ways to ensure, or many ways in which you could meet standard 2.4. So I use a numbering system. Many people use course maps. Some people use module introductions. So that is also something you might want to discuss with your instructional designers of which of those various options makes the most sense for your particular course. And in fact, they may all make sense, in which case it may become an aesthetic issue. I've heard people say, oh, well, why do I need to make the relationships clear? It should be obvious to students. Well, that is an assumption that it's obvious to students. It may not be obvious to students. Because if it were obvious to students, they would have possibly more substantive discussion board posts. Or it might be obvious to 90% of your students, but we are teaching 100% of our students. So even if it's only 10% who need these clearly stated, that still benefits those 10% of students. Another thing I've heard is, well, students don't read. They're not going to pay attention to this. Well, in that sense, You can do everything you can to make them pay attention. They may pay attention, they may not pay attention, but we want to design our courses under the assumption that students are paying attention, that maybe students miss something here or there, but overall, if they miss it, they miss it. That being said, it's still there to support students if they're going through things more carefully. So I know sometimes people say less is more, but especially in online learning, that's not necessarily the case. More is more. Now, whether the more is mandatory to students is one thing, but providing students as much information, even if it's redundant, even if you think students may not read it, it's important to have it there to support students. Just like we can't always control whether students are going to show up to our physical classroom, we can't always ensure that students are going to read everything carefully. We can only do our best, but we have to do it. We do need to build our courses under that assumption that they will use all the information available to them. So questions about, any additional questions about 5.1, 4.1, or 2.4?
And Adam, just to add to that as well, something I wanted to talk about was with respect to our Quality Essentials program. That's something that the blueprint is intended to help address, like to distinctly or explicitly show that relationship between course learning objectives and the activities and the content. I'm going to pull up a course here that I think does a pretty good job at that. I can just jump to another tab. Okay, so the blueprint is intended again to help make these relationships very clear with respect to the content, the practice activities, the assessments that that are going to be existing or as they're placed throughout your course. And so, kind of as Adam mentioned, course mapping is one of those ways that you can do that, where if we look backwards to looking at the content here, we see that lecture video. This is again instructional material that helps support the module learning objectives. Here, this instructor made it a point to show the relationship not just between the module learning objectives, but also the course learning objective. So we'll see both of them listed here. So we just look backwards to module learning objectives 1.1 through 1.3. We can then identify and again distinguish and show that relationship between the purpose of this content or this activity and what it's intended to do and accomplish. And then going even one step back, we can see how that relates to the course learning objectives as again explicitly making these relationships clear. So again, the blueprint as provided as part of our Quality Essentials 1 program is intended to do just that. So if you don't already have a mapping system or a numbering system, this is, I think, something that you can make use of that'll make it easy to then plug into your course as you begin to develop and design your course or redesign. But I do want to address any questions if there are any. And I don't think I'm seeing any. Okay, yeah, that was what I wanted to add here. You want to move on to the next standard, Adam?
Sure. So the relationship between, the tools used in the course support and learning objectives or competencies. So tools are really any of the technologies you use to support the learning objective. So all tools are not all technologies are tools, but all tools are technologies. So for instance, a computer is a technology, but it's not necessarily a tool to build learning objectives. But Beachboard is a tool. And you want to also be as specific as possible. So Beachboard is a tool. Beachboard quizzes are a tool. Beachboard discussion boards are a tool. Beachboard rubrics are a tool. YouTube is a tool. If you're asking students to write in Microsoft Word format, Microsoft Word is a tool. And the thing with standard step 0.1 is you want to make sure that you are using the right tools. And by right tools, it doesn't mean, oh, there's this cool thing that would be best. It's just more what you use is appropriate. So for instance, if you want to do group discussion, using Beachboard Dropboxes is not an appropriate tool. Likewise, if you want to use essays, have students write essays, well, then the Dropbox is an appropriate tool. It's also, this standard means don't put bells and whistles in just for the sake of having bells and whistles. Textbooks are not a tool, ebooks are. I've not necessarily heard that distinction. I think part of it may be the extent to which is the ebook mandatory or not. So if it's a matter of students can choose between a physical textbook and an ebook, then they're probably instructional materials. But if you have an ebook that has specific learning activities or assessments, in that case, it is a tool. So I know lots of people use publisher material. Frequently, those publisher materials include pre-designed quizzes, pre-designed PowerPoints. Those would be examples of tools then. Again, Quality Matters likes to treat everything as if they're clear cut. This is a tool, this is instructional material, this is a learning activity. In practice, it's not. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about all of them. Quality Matters Review said only e-textbook. That's what I've found, that as much as Quality Matters likes to say these rubrics are clear cut, they're not. So for instance, I took the peer reviewer course through Quality Matters, and I was told in those when writing helpful reviews, never say the word should, say you might consider. I just started the master reviewer course, and on one of the assessments, that's how I wrote it, and the person facilitating the master's reviewer course says, no, you shouldn't say the instructor might consider, you should say you should do X. So as much as Quality Matters likes to say there are clear consistencies, it varies a little bit more. But that doesn't mean that all of the different ways you meet those QM standards aren't valuable. But that's another thing about, we're doing QE right here based on QM as opposed to QM itself. I know some of you might go through then the formal peer review process, but right now, obviously, as it's been tried to say before, QE is based on QM, but QE is not QM. And I think ATS recognizes that some of these standards are going to be easier to meet than others, just given the logistics of we're doing this over a summer. My course to get QM certified, it was a 2-year process. If we're talking about when I first started designing the course with QM in mind, through all the steps to formal QM approval. Does ATS have anything they want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, like, as you're pointing out, yeah, this is a QE, right? This is our kind of iteration of what it looks like and how we're implementing the standards. It's something I'm hearing in performing course reviews is that it does feel like it's splitting hairs with respect to like some of the nuance between these standards. So something I find that's really helpful is referencing the QM rubric. I mean, that is still like especially the annotations, because that's where it really provides like the depth and some of the examples as well in terms of, what you want to kind of focus and tunnel in on. So it's nice to have like blinders sometimes and just look at the exact like text and the definitions of what it is that the standards are referenced and how they're referenced in the rubric. So just to touch on the 6.1, this most recent like alignment standard we were looking at. It's like you mentioned, right? It's not just adding tools for the sake of tools, right? I think that's kind of the purpose of it, is making sure that everything that we're including with respect to instructional materials, the tools, that there's intent behind it, right? That we want to make sure that there is an alignment with why we're incorporating, because if it doesn't serve the learning objectives or competencies, then it has no place in your course. So I think that's kind of what I'm finding helpful is, again, going back to the rubric, reading through the annotation carefully, and if I feel like it sticks there, or if I'm finding that evidence that I'm looking for that helps, meet the standard, then it stays. And if it doesn't, then it's something you want to reconsider or just think about. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, one thing I heard from students, and again, students are not always the most reliable narrators, but many of them felt that a lot of us took training about all these cool tools ATS has, and faculty added them even though it doesn't serve a purpose, that at least to them, it seemed like faculty added things for the sake of adding things now that they knew about them. That may or may not be the case, but you want to check to ensure that you are not using PlayPosit or Flipgrid or Labster just because you have access to them. The other thing then also is, this gets to just the whole make things clear to students. So if you're getting a sense that students find things superfluous, and you know for a fact they're not, then articulate to them why the tools are used as they are. It may not get through to everyone, but it'll get through a lot. I've found that I've been most successful the more clear I set my expectations, the more I try to demystify the underlying logic to the course design. Does it make all students happy? No. But does it help for a lot of students? Yes.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right by saying, like, you can't really overdo it, right? You can't provide more information than is necessary, even if it seems redundant. And it's if it's intended to, again, provide that clarity, then but all the more reason to include it and make that clear.
I mean, and one thing to know also when it comes to learning activities, and even when it comes to formative assessments, just because there are points doesn't make it an assessment. And just because it's an assessment doesn't mean it has points. So while I do have points for those self-check quizzes, in some of my AMI courses, I have self-assessments where students practice the learning objectives, they get the correct answer, but they're not for points. So I don't require that they do them. I strongly recommend they do, and they serve a similar function. So in some respects also, there's no harm in having more learning activities that are optional in addition to having any learning activities that are required. There's no such thing as providing students too much support. Hold on. Digital environments, incorporate textbooks that are not digital. Oh, thanks, Marissa. Yes.
One thing that I was going to add is people are going through this process is to consider that if they're looking towards getting their course QM certified, that in addition to all of the quality essentials, we do have another internal review process after that to support them for that finally submitting it to QM. So I think the nice thing about that is continuing to be able to revisit all of these standards and kind of take it to the next level in terms of the annotations like Paul was referring to, and really just going in there and saying, okay, how can I make this standard even that much better support the students? So, it's like, can we meet the level of QM to get an 85%? Yes, potentially, but we want to keep holding ourselves to that highest standard to make it even better and better.
I mean, I would say also, just in terms of what we've been talking about last week, this week, that after it's just my personal opinion, after the alignment standards, 2.4 is probably one of the most important standards to a successful course when it comes to pedagogy. That's just my personal opinion but in terms of what I've seen has contributed the greatest to student success and greatest to student satisfaction in terms of their spot scores, which, regardless of what you think about their validity, at the end of the day are important to all of us who are not full professors. And even to many full professors, it's important, but those are probably 2.4, making sure the relationship is clear, is probably the most important non-alignment standard in terms of, in some respects, it may even be more important in terms of the student satisfaction or the student's understanding. Obviously, without alignment, you can't address 2.4 because if things aren't aligned, you can't show the relationship. But that making the relationship clear is very important to students. So I try to do it both with the numbering system, but also even through my syllabus, say, here is why I have these assignments. Here is what you should do to practice learning objectives. So that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would agree, Adam. I think that's a very important standard. Again, it makes it clear to students without there's no assumptions, right, in terms of why this activity is here. What's the purpose of why I'm engaging and following through these activities that I'm supposed to do, and not understanding that connection. So
Right.
as a
And it's
non-aligned,
something, right. And it's something that's a lot easier to do in synchronous courses because you can just tell them in real time. Or you'll need to, but this is, you don't have that real time ability to answer the question, why is this important? You kind of have to clearly make it known prior. It's still good to make it known prior in synchronous classes, but I think there's a greater consequence for not making it clear in asynchronous classes.
yeah, it really helps with the understand it helps manage expectations as well from the learner's perspective as they begin to look at through your course and modules it's just, again, it's that clarity goes a long way for these online courses. So yeah, again, disagree that this is that 2.4 is and this, again, it's essential. It's worth 3 points, right? So I think that also speaks to its contribution to your course design.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions for me before you go in your breakout rooms?
I'm seeing the blueprint that should be available if this. I think the self-assessment form. So if you refer, all of the materials that you've been seeing today are available in the Quality Essentials course. So Mohammed, if you go into the content area, there's a module where you'll find all these resources. So including the blueprint and the checklist. If you want in the breakout room, we could take some time to review that as well. So we can go ahead and help you locate those. And yeah, any other questions before we get into breakout rooms and just take a deep dive into the standards and get you to share, what these standards look like in your course? And if not, then Frank, I think we can break out into rooms or use breakout rooms. And again, that's going to be 3. Thank you, Mark, for sharing that direct link. So there you go. Module 6 is where you can find those resources.